Hello, Gotham girls and Gotham boys. You are listening to the Arkham Sessions, the only show that psychoanalyzes Batman the Animated Series episode by episode. My name is Dr. Andrea Letamendi, and I'm joined by my co-host slash super nerd slash super geek slash awesome person, Brian Ward.
Hello, Andrea. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Any opportunity to sit down with a fellow super nerd, super geek, and fellow super awesome person.
See, now I take that as a compliment.
You should. You should. It was meant as a compliment. This is a big week for us because this is an episode that a lot of people have been waiting for, and it's taken us until season 2 to get there. But we are finally going to talk about Trial. But before we do that, I want to read to you an email that a longtime listener has sent us. And this is a great email, Drea, and I think it's important, especially since we're talking about season 2 episodes, for people who have been listening all along and maybe have forgotten along the way. It's important to clarify things. And this is something that I think it's a valuable question. And that email, Drea, if you're ready, is... Could you explain the difference between a sociopath and someone with low empathy? You see, I'm autistic, and we tend to, as I've come to understand it, have either high empathy or low empathy. Mine, as I've learned, is high. Everything that happens to someone else or myself affects me very deeply, to the point where I risk emotional meltdown by watching the news too often or reading a book where too many bad things happen. But I have a friend in the autistic community who has low empathy. And as I've come to understand it through her, she's a very good person. She's kind to me and to others in spite of not being able to empathize. She simply needs things explained to her using different non-emotional contexts than other people. But she doesn't lack a conscience or treat people badly or lack caring for other people's situations. She feels emotions, she just doesn't seem to be able to experience other people's. So I'm wondering what the difference is between low empathy and sociopathy, and also whether sociopathy is automatically bad.
Great question. I'm so glad this came up because over the course of the show, we've talked about sociopathy, and we've talked about low empathy or low emotional intelligence. We've had a few conversations about some characters that show lack of empathy, and I think it's important to clarify. Certainly the first thing I want to say is that there's a lot of us. I say us because I don't see this as black and white, and certainly the field doesn't see this as black and white. Either you have empathy or you don't. Mm-hmm. There's a spectrum. There's a variety of our different abilities to be able to recognize emotions, to express emotions, to connect on an emotional level. And when we've talked about emotional intelligence and when we've talked about empathy on the show, we are really talking about that ability to exercise those skills, the ability to demonstrate emotional awareness, the ability to express the emotions, and the ability to read emotions and connect with other people. So as I keep saying this, I realize what we're saying is really important when it comes to interpersonal relationships, socializing, success in the world. Mm-hmm. The email that you just read reminds me that it is so important to be able to connect on an emotional level with other people. It really allows us to be successful socially and interpersonally. So it's a big deal. Having said that, yes, there are a lot of people who might be more challenged in that area. And certainly, I mean, hands should be raised. A lot of people may identify as being on the autism spectrum, and may even have been diagnosed with autism or Asperger's, which currently is not a diagnosis, but has been in the past. And there's a reason why it's called a spectrum, in that there's a continuum, if you will, mm-hmm. of those abilities, of those empathic skills. Now, sociopathy is a completely different spectrum. It's a completely different dimension. That has to do not so much with your ability to connect with other people and read emotions, but that has to do with your lack of caring of pain and suffering. Like when we've talked about characters who demonstrate behaviors that we would say that's sociopathic, it's when they deliberately enact violent or dangerous behaviors and put others and sometimes themselves at risk, and they have no insight into the pain and suffering and the human dignity of other people. And it's a different, I would consider that separate than what we've just talked about. Right. So I appreciate that this writer, that this audience member had asked about that, because I think when we've talked about it, we haven't really made it clear. But one has to do with just areas of emotional intelligence that certainly one may have a deficit in that, or one may struggle with that. And on a completely different dimension is this lack of caring and an interest in harming others. And that is that lack of a conscience. So does that make sense, that difference?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think it's been great because it gives us an opportunity also, because we've had the question before in the past where even diagnoses don't necessarily mean that you're a bad person. And I think that that's important. And I think that sort of goes along with this question, that having a diagnosis or having low empathy or having high empathy or whatever doesn't mean that you are lumped into any single group. And this is something that you say every single week. Just because you have certain symptoms or a certain diagnosis, it doesn't mean that you are a bad person or a killer or whatever. I mean, I remember we had an email where someone said, you know, I have a son who has been diagnosed with some disorder. You know, does that mean that I need to worry because I'm listening to this show and I'm realizing that a lot of these villains show this? And you were very quick to say, no, absolutely not. Having that diagnosis doesn't make you a supervillain or a villain of any kind.
Right.
And I think that it's very important to get questions like this so that we can continue to clarify as the show goes on that none of the things that we talk about mean that you are going to be a bad person if you happen to have low empathy or or antisocial personality disorder, borderline disorder.
Right. And certainly low empathy is one of many characteristics, right? Like, it's not like you can open the DSM and see that, well, low empathy means you have this disorder or that disorder. It's, I hate to be so simplistic about this analogy, but it's like, well, I have you go to your doctor and say, I have a rash. Well, that's a symptom and could mean a number of things, right? So low empathy is just like that. It's a symptom that could lead you toward a number of very different diagnoses, or it could just lead you to just a characteristic like that. I just happen to have lower empathy than other people. Right. That doesn't necessarily mean you have mental health disorder. And then finally, of course, sociopathy is not a mental health disorder. It's a cultural, legal term that refers to persons who don't demonstrate an understanding or care for other people's pain and suffering. And sure, there are different measures and scales that you could use to check, to assess for this, but this is not a mental health disorder. It's more of a social, cultural label that's used a lot of times, unfortunately, to categorize criminals.
So that's perfect. And I'm glad that you answered that question. I hope it helps. Let's move on to this episode, because this one is a doozy. We are officially in the second season. Drea, by the way, did you know that the episode that you and I are about to cover was actually intended to be the first feature film for Batman, the animated series? This was going to be Mask of the Phantasm, essentially, but they figured out that it would really work better as a 22-minute show than a drawn-out, probably 90-minute animated movie. So they ended up doing Mask of the Phantasm instead. But that just shows you the quality of idea that this episode is, and that's really because It is from none other than Mr. Paul Dini and Mr. Bruce Timm. If you want quality Batman the Animated Series, those two gentlemen are going to be behind it. And in this case, Paul Dini wrote it from a story from both of them. Bruce, of course, directed it. And it is Trial.
And why do I feel like anytime the two of them are involved, their vision is to attempt to put as many characters as possible into one episode, but in a way that it doesn't seem chaotic and silly and contrived. It all works so well and wraps things up so quickly, and yet you have this really rich, really dynamic story that is a classic of this series.
Well, what's really interesting is this episode, because it comes in just after season 2 started, it almost acts as a wrap up for season 1. I mean, you're reintroduced to a number of the supervillains from the previous season, and you are given an opportunity to sort of revisit their original stories.
Oh, so it's like last season on Batman the animated series.
Yeah, a little bit. But I will say that the characters seem to have taken a drastic turn, and you and I are going to talk about that a little bit, because I'm wondering if maybe the toll is being taken, fighting against the Batman when it comes to these characters. So let's talk about this. We start out in a courtroom.
Pamela Lillian Isley. District Attorney Van Dorn has asked that the maximum sentence of life imprisonment be imposed upon you. However, as your apprehension came at the hands of the Batman and not a recognized agent of the law, this court has no choice but to return you to Arkham Asylum, where it is hoped you will complete your rehabilitation.
Right?
Wow.
You got a guy here who is recognizing the fact that Batman is actually hurting the system. By bringing these people in, they are not being given due process.
Right.
And they are not going through all the motions in order to be thrown into prison for the rest of their lives. Instead, they're being sent to Arkham Asylum, which apparently has a much more lax system for being able to get in and out.
Well, I think that obviously Arkham Asylum is a center is such a kind word for Arkham Asylum. It's a center for, like he said, for rehabilitation and for focusing on the psychiatric mental health issues that could have impacted these individuals into lives of crime. So in a way, I mean, I sort of look at this like, well, they're doing their due diligence. They're recognizing that there's a health issue and they're addressing it with intervention that will keep this person safe and keep the community safe until they're ready to be reintegrated. So Batman's doing a good...
But you've said in the past that she might not actually, I mean, I think the first time we looked at Pamela Isley, I believe maybe you had mentioned something like borderline, where she was using the other people, and manipulating them, and emotionally, and she was doing it all for this and that. But since then, you have changed your opinion because she doesn't seem to necessarily be fitting those. I don't know that Pamela deserves to be in an asylum. She's certainly a criminal, and she should certainly be in Blackgate. But I don't know that she is mentally or criminally insane, if you will. It seems like they are throwing her into Arkham because by default, by technicality, they can't put her behind bars.
Right.
And as you've pointed out in the past, Arkham is an interesting facility where they almost placate to the things that that your triggers, the things that make you sick in some way. I mean,
or your coping mechanisms.
They're always used as weapons. So I don't understand. But you would get the sense that maybe if Pamela were thrown in prison instead of in Arkham, where she is allowed to play with plants and grow things and do stuff like that, you would think that maybe they would have a shot at keeping her behind bars, which makes you wonder if this is all part of Batman's plan, if he likes these people getting out on a regular basis. And
right.
But I want to talk about this prosecutor who we've seen before. It's Janet Van Dorn, and she is really upset at this. I mean, clearly she's probably put in the effort to win a case against Poison Ivy, and even the judge seems to agree that Ivy is guilty and needs to go somewhere. But because of the way that Batman has sort of muffed this case up a little bit, Janet is none too pleased.
Not only does Batman create these so-called super criminals, he takes it upon himself to be their judge and jury with no regard for the legal system.
Jay, what do you think? I memean, is Batman actually hurting Gotham City's law enforcement?
Well, I'm inclined to believe that the law enforcement or the system that exists in Gotham City is incompetent. That it's not necessarily corrupt, but that there's a reason that these supervillains are terrorizing and taking over the city, and you need someone like Batman to bend the rule. We talked about this in the last episode with Bullock and Batman, that you need individuals who are able to bend the rules a little bit and have subtle beliefs, differences in morality in order to go after them and to take them down. So
right, but as we also saw, Bullock doesn't know how to read Miranda rights, so that guy probably got off just the same way. But I'm going to call you out here, because when we established this show, we established a show where we were only allowed to reference what we saw in Batman the Animated Series, and I would argue that you have not seen incompetence in the GCPD. You have not seen corruption in the GCPD in the animated series. Now, you have seen a guy who refuses to tell Commissioner Gordon, the proper answers to clues. I mean, you have seen Gordon. If anything, I would say Gordon is the incompetent, because he's the one who relies on Batman. He basically leans on Batman like a crutch. The others aren't necessarily, they're being held back because Bullock wants to go after the criminals. Montoya wants to go after the criminals. All these other, good cops want to pursue the criminals. But Gordon is like, no, let the Batman do it. Everything's
yeah, I mean,
fine.
I certainly feel like he is the unofficial member of their team. And I like Janet, because it sounds to me like she is somebody who is trying to tighten the reins and really try to obey the law and do it right to ensure that these criminals get what they deserve.
Well, let's hear what she has to say about the Batman.
Janet, it's a war zone out there, and Batman is our best weapon.
And I say he's a drug the city keeps taking to avoid facing reality.
I mean, come on.
Wow.
And I got to be honest, and it's not because I am a non-Batman apologist. She's not wrong. The city leans on Batman, and I'm not sure that it's in Batman's interest to have that sort of pressure put on him, because clearly the villains just keep flocking to Gotham, and he can't hold them at bay, and yet everyone else has risen to this sort of level of incompetence where Arkham Asylum can't keep them inside, Blackgate can't keep them inside, Gordon can't go after the people because he's relying on the Batman. God forbid the Batman disappear, which he kind of does, and we see in this episode that Gordon's freaked out over it. I mean, it's as if Paul Dini and Bruce Timm jumped forward in time and heard our podcast and our criticisms of Batman and the way that Gotham City works, and then went back in time and wrote this episode. So, what does Batman think of this assessment?
Whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that comes a little bit later. Here's what happens. Pamela Isley goes back to Arkham.
Hi, Red! Hi! Welcome home!
Home, that's their home.
It clearly. And she's informed that there's going to be a big party, And right then and there, Jervis Tetch, the Mad Hatter, places his mind control cards, which he probably shouldn't have access to, but because he's in Arkham Asylum, it's his coping mechanism, to have these cards. He places them in the hats of the security guards. The security guards are then under his control, and suddenly the inmates or patients at Arkham have taken over the asylum, and they are going to put together a courtroom scenario. They have got a mock trial. They have kidnapped Janet, and they eventually end up kidnapping Batman. This shouldn't come as a surprise because Batman finds himself kidnapped or tied up or prisoner in every single episode.
In this case, he's in a straitjacket, pretty much incapacitated, and dragged into Arkham Asylum to be prosecuted by everyone,
every member of the rogues gallery that's ever existed.
That should be frightening for him. This should be his worst nightmare.
Whatever.
And that's pretty much how he takes it. But so who do we have here? We've got the ventriloquist, who actually sort of works as the bailiff.
Court is now in session. The good people of Arkham Asylum versus the self-righteous vigilante called Batman. Our prosecutor is ready, likewise our fair and impartial jury.
Hang him!
Shoot him!
Hit him with a rock!
Of course, Croc.
Yeah.
You got Killer Croc. You have Harley Quinn. Mm-hmm. Poison Ivy.
We've got Scarecrow. We've got Poison Ivy. In the background, we've got the Riddler. He doesn't say anything in this episode, but we've got the Riddler sitting there in the jury. And then, of course, who is the judge? The Joker himself. So we've got everyone you could possibly want. Oh, and who's the prosecutor? Former DA Harvey Dent, known as Two-Face. So he is prosecuting, and you got Van Dorn, who has no interest in defending the Batman because she actually thinks that Batman should be on trial with the rest of them. But the deal is, if she's able to get him off, then she and Batman are set free.
Easy.
Yeah. Well, we'll say it's a pretty harsh room.
Proceed, counselor.
So the very first person she has the opportunity to talk to is Jervis Tetch. And this is why I say that it's sort of a refresher course for those who don't remember. It's because she is talking to the Mad Hatter, and she brings up the fact that Batman ended up basically arresting Jervis after he stalked Alice, his young assistant, and that this ended up putting him sort of down the road into his life of crime. And this is something we've seen. We've seen him talk about and blame Batman actually on several occasions for getting in the way and for being the one who is really to blame. So that arc seems fairly consistent. But something that I thought was interesting is he blames Batman, and then she says,
"You could have respected her wishes and left her alone."
I'd have killed her first!
This is the first time that we've ever seen Jervis be murderous.
Right.
Which, I mean, we're now seeing a completely different side of Tetch, which is why I said earlier that, we get to see these people and they're fairly consistent, but then also they're we're seeing new sides.
Well, I think it's important that we saw this because when we covered Jervis, we were discussing the aspect of stalking and the aspect of obsession and following somebody and objectifying someone and romanticizing inappropriately in the way that he did. And our our hypothesis is that he took it down. His approach was pathological, that he wasn't simply, he didn't have this puppy love adoration for her, that he was, his level of obsession was dangerous. It was threatening, and it violated her rights. And so here we see Van Dorn point out that that is criminal, that is, that it's violating her rights and dignities, that she is almost advocating for this other woman that she doesn't know well, but certainly in a way that demonstrates that she's pointing out he willingly engaged in that behavior, in that criminal behavior. Because remember, the charge against Batman in this episode, or the reason he's on trial, is that they're claiming he created these villains and maintained their criminal lifestyle for being who he is. And she's pointing out, no, it's not, it has nothing to do with Batman's interference or involvement. It has to do with those individual criminals and their tendency toward, violence and obsession and threats and violations and everything that we talked about. So, in a way, she's starting to realize just how dangerous these criminals are and just how much he's needed.
It does really become a little bit scary when you realize that had Batman not intervened originally, Jervis Tetch might have ended up killing Alice because she was never going to reciprocate.
That's a really good point.
So, okay, I will chalk that one up to the Batman maybe doing the right thing by intervening.
Janet Van Dorn doesn't like Batman doing her job anyway.
Oh, wow, that happened. All right. So the next person we end up seeing is Harley. Now, this is an interesting moment, Drea, because, of course, you are familiar with the comics, and you're familiar with many of the Batman and Robin Adventures comics that coincided with the animated series and sort of acted as companion pieces. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the very first time that we were really shown Harley's backstory, that you and I both know as a psychologist at Arkham Asylum, it was introduced in Mad Love.
Right, the comic book by Paul Dini and drawn by Bruce Timm.
Mad Love was released on newsstands prior to this episode, which is probably, why they reference that particular story.
You got your comics on newsstands?
Sometimes you didn't have a comic book shop nearby, and you would have to go and hit the local newsstand or a grocery store where they had them on racks, spinning racks.
Lucky.
Yeah, well, not really, because the comic book shops had a significantly larger number of comics, and probably up to date. But up until this particular episode, we've not heard that actually mentioned in the animated series itself. I mean, we've certainly gotten to know Harley. We certainly know about her tumultuous past with the Joker, but we didn't, frankly, know that she was a doctor at Arkham Asylum until this episode. And then what do we hear Janet Van Dorn say while questioning Harley?
Sad, isn't it? Harleen Quinzel was a doctor here at Arkham until the Joker twisted her mind.
This sends Harley into a frenzy, and she ends up attacking the Joker when she finds out that the Joker probably has no real love for Harley, and in fact was going to give her up in order to get less time, which seems odd to me because I don't think that you could possibly make a deal with the Joker that would give him less time if Pamela Isley was going to be sentenced to life for whatever it was she was doing. But he tried to give Harley up, and she freaked out, and Killer Croc had to escort her from the courtroom. But then we get to talk to Pamela, and Pamela actually says something that seems, again, a little smart to me.
You should have let me bump off Harvey Dent. We'd all have been better off, wouldn't we, Harv?
Are you
I mean, she's not wrong. If Harvey Dent had died at the hands of Poison Ivy, that's one less member of the Rogues Gallery that Batman would have to be dealing with at this point.
That's true.
So really, I would chalk that one up to Rogues. Because while he didn't necessarily create Two-Face, he has certainly kept him alive and working. Everyone else, you could say, maybe were motivated by other things.
But Miss Isley, isn't the real motivation for your crimes your obsession with plants? That you prefer them to people?
I love plants, honey. But a rose is a rose.
Then it doesn't bother you when someone, let's say the judge here, ruthlessly plucks a defenseless flower from the warm, green earth.
No.
Even knowing he's given it his death sentence? That its petals must die?
Stop it.
One by one, withering, falling, one by one, until it's all gone, honey.
Honey.
Ivy attacks, and she's got to be pulled off of Van Dorn. So in her final summation, Van Dorn actually comes to an interesting conclusion. Her opinion of Batman is turned around, and she concludes,
the truth is, you created him.
What do you think, Drea? Do you think that she's got a point there? Do you think that Batman only exists because of the supervillains?
I think I agree with that. She goes on to say that no matter what, no Batman or not, you would still be here. The gimmicks would be different, but you would still end up the same. And I think that there's some truth to that. She's essentially saying that there's some inherent personality related, emotionally related, mental health related internal issue with these individuals, that they are driven and motivated by things, and no matter the role that Batman takes, they're going to engage in their criminal behavior. And I think that she makes it very clear to say that, you know, you all have these different gimmicks and different methods that you're using, but at the end of the day, you would still be in Arkham Asylum.
Yeah, I just don't know that I buy that they created Batman. I mean, I think you're right. I you know, certainly as I look at the juror box, you've got Tetch, and Jervis wasn't created by the Batman. It wasn't an encounter with Batman that ended up giving him this Mad Hatter persona. Ivy was not created by the Batman. Croc certainly wasn't. You know, we know his story from, you know, back in the circus. Who else? Scarecrow was not created by Batman, but Batman existed before we met these characters, so they didn't create him. Crime created him, but really it was a mugging, and then some gangster crime, and some, you know,
some bats.
Yeah, well, and it wasn't crime that was any different than what you and I have here in Los Angeles. I mean, it's a smaller community, and it's the crime is more rampant in Gotham City for sure. It's a cesspool of crime, but the crime wasn't super crime probably until Batman showed up. Do you disagree?
No, I see your point. I think that there's, what's interesting about this entire episode is that you have these showcases, these demonstrations of who these villains are, and once again, this isn't an episode about Batman. Very little about this episode is about Batman, but it shines a light onto who he is as a character, that he is in some way tied into each of these villains. And I think that it allows us to have this conversation, like, well, what would happen if he didn't exist? Or what would happen if, you know, they didn't exist? What would happen to him? What would his identity be around? So I think this is all an exercise in understanding that he is a huge part of the villain community, and
sure,
his relationships with them are, you know, they're pretty apparent.
I do think that they created him, now that I'm thinking about it, in the sense that by becoming supervillains. Let's be honest, if you're wanting to take down common muggings in Gotham City, if you're wanting to take down bank robbers, you probably don't need to go and learn the way of the samurai. Or, you know, any of those, you know, highly trained skills that Bruce Wayne went and mastered. You probably don't need to master lockpicking in the Chinese water cell. You probably don't need to learn all those things if that's what you're going to go take down. But it was almost as if he was preparing, knowing that the supervillains would ultimately be
right
in Gotham City. So maybe they did create him to some degree. And I think what is kind of weird about this episode, but I love it, is that the jurors sort of look at themselves and they realize, well, let me just play it for you.
Your Honor, in light of Ms. Van Dorn's stirring defense, we have no choice but to find the defendant not guilty.
I mean, they agree. They can be honest with themselves. Batman did not create them. They may have contributed in some way to the creation of Batman, and maybe it's all harmonious. Maybe Batman's existence keeps them going and they keep Batman going. It's all sort of symbiotic. But that doesn't mean that Joker's going to play fair. In fact, he makes it clear that they're criminals and they're going to kill them both anyway.
And now for the final confession. The big secret you've kept from us for so many years. Brothers and sisters, at long last I give you the man behind the bat.
In the past, I think the Joker hasn't been as interested in unmasking him, but this is all part of the debasement and humiliation of Batman, right? We've put him in a straitjacket, we've dragged him through, we've put him on trial, we've blamed him for all of our sins, and now we're going to tie him to this slab, and they want to unmask him as part of this, you know, final desecration of him, and I think the crowd, you know, this is a little bit of a mob mentality. The crowd is what is exciting the Joker and causing him to want to unmask him and reveal who he is. And of course, everyone's excited about it as well.
Absolutely. And that's when Janet takes a batarang that she's had in her pocket since Batman delivered another criminal to their windowsill. And she uses it to knock out a light, which gives Batman the opportunity to fight back. And then he really ends up pummeling everyone else. And thus concludes the trial of the Batman. But really, a number of opinions are swayed in this episode. You've got the jurors who don't think that Batman contributed to their existence necessarily. And then you've got Janet Van Dorn, who wanted Batman prosecuted, just like the criminals in Gotham. But by the end of this episode, she has turned over a new leaf.
I see now there's a need for the things you do. But I'm still going to work toward a city that doesn't need Batman.
Me too.
Is that true? Do you really think Batman is working toward a city that doesn't need him? I don't think so, because again, we've got this guy. We've said we don't know what would happen to Bruce Wayne if suddenly he didn't have anybody to go up against.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think this episode is more about the perspective of Janet, and that many of us might relate to her and question, like, well, if I like this superhero, if I am a fan of Batman, what does that mean about my morality? What does that mean about how I feel about right or wrong? And I think that this is one of those episodes where, especially if you're a youngster, you're thinking about that, and this is demonstrating that he's doing whatever he can to defend, you know, what's just. And I think that you have this strong, intelligent female professional enacting that, you know, putting that into play by stating the things that some of us might think. You know, he's bending rules. He's not a real prosecutor, or he's not really a part of the system, and yet he's interfering with what we're doing. And she was able to see him as a human being, and essentially by putting him on trial and by having to be essentially being forced to defend him, she's trying to understand his motives and understand what he's doing from his perspective. But this brings up a really interesting area of social psychology. So I want to ask you this question.
Okay.
Do you think by simply having to defend him, she has changed her opinion of him?
Well, I think to a degree, because, but I don't think that it's the defense of Batman so much as it's the prosecution of those putting him on trial. I mean, she doesn't use anything, you know, to credit Batman's personality and his motives. What she does is she takes the things that the criminals have done, and she uses those things against them. So I don't know that she's really necessarily taken a solid look at the Batman so much as she has taken an even more thorough look at those he goes after, and she realizes that that creates a need for the Batman.
Well, I'll ask you this question then. Do you think this is fact or fiction? When your beliefs are challenged with facts, you alter your opinions and incorporate the new information into your thinking.
I tend to, but I'm sure, like a lot of people, if there are things that I am steadfast in my beliefs, I may not be won over by simple facts.
Exactly. So the truth is that when our deepest convictions are challenged by contradictory evidence, our beliefs actually get stronger. This is called the backfire effect, and it actually happens a lot lately on social media like Twitter and Facebook, where someone challenges us or gives us literature or research or some kind of article that states the opposite, or gives us facts that should change our minds. But we actually, almost inexplicably, we actually strengthen our beliefs and counter back. And that's why it's called the backfire effect.
And so it's the kind of thing that we're seeing in politics a lot.
Exactly. Yes. So the reason for that is that we hold these narratives, or what psychologists call narrative scripts. These are the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we hold dear, our beliefs, our strongly held values. And, you know, in the past, we've talked about confirmation bias. Do you remember what that was, Brian?
No.
Confirmation bias is when we actively seek evidence, information, stuff out in our environment that confirms our beliefs.
Okay.
So just as an example, let's say that you believe that climate change isn't a thing. It's just some theory, some liberal theory that people made up. And you'll look for evidence that backs up your beliefs or theories rather than it's almost like you have a filter. You seek information that supports your beliefs, and you don't pay much attention to actual facts, you know, literature, data, research that opposes or in some way could threaten your beliefs. Does that make sense? So you'd be like, wow, well, you know, we've had one of the coldest winters we've had in a really long time. That therefore my belief about climate change being BS is correct. So that's confirmation bias. Backfire effect is when you are actually given information and you take that information and it somehow makes your beliefs stronger, even though that information is the opposite of what you believe.
Okay.
So the reason I bring up the backfire effect is that what we see in this episode is Janet was forced to take on the defense of someone that she doesn't like, someone that she believes is immoral, someone who she believes is bad for the city. And then her attitudes turn around. And this is the part of the episode that is slightly unrealistic, because when we see the backfire effect take place, what would actually happen is that she would come out of this experience feeling even more strongly that he's a bad influence, that he's bad for the city, and creating these criminals.
Fascinating. I mean, she's also a prosecutor who wouldn't normally be in the position of defending someone. So yeah, I could see her being upset with the idea of having to defend someone she thinks is a criminal. But she would also have very little regard for this court system anyway. Like it doesn't hold up in any way.
Well, exactly, right. So I'd assume that she would come out of this experience feeling that this entire thing was hokey and BS, and she would continue to feel what she's felt for years, which is that the system is right, the system is just, and this vigilante is the opposite of that and has no purpose, has no positioning in the system.
We had an email from our good listener, Leah, who asked an interesting question. We brought up the fact that the Riddler doesn't actually speak in this episode. We also brought up the fact that that there are a number of people who want to learn Batman's identity in the end. And Riddler has always been very adamant about, outwitting the Batman and, wanting to, I'll let her say, she says, given that the writer's Bible calls him probably the one most likely to try to learn Batman's secret identity, you would have expected him to be more involved, especially near the end. And yet nothing. Now we can chalk that up to, they couldn't get the voice, they couldn't get yet another voice cast member in this really expensive episode, I would imagine. But it is interesting to just sort of see Riddler sitting back there, not saying anything, not trying to jump at the chance to unmask
Maybe he thought
Batman.
he was above all this. Like, his intelligence is so high that he just thought this entire thing was a bunch of kids in a sandbox and he'd wanted nothing to do with it.
Well, she does say, now that we get the opportunity to talk about it, Riddler is sitting there, and that means that he is no longer in the virtual reality that he had trapped himself in. And she is wondering if that the trauma of being trapped in that virtual reality may have actually, been behind his silence, his inability to,
oh my gosh, that's so sad.
He's just sitting there quietly.
He's like suffering from the repercussions of coming back to the world.
Maybe that's the answer.
I think this is this.
Maybe he's not even back in the world yet. Maybe his body is literally, because his mind is in the computer.
He's still connected to the Matrix.
Maybe he is just sitting there, dead to the world, comatose. His body is physically in the chair.
Oh, wait. No. This is the Matrix. This is the virtual reality. And because he's playing God, he's basically masterminding this whole thing. He doesn't have to do anything. He just sits there and watches.
This is Sherwood's imagination.
Oh, this is Sherwood. This is all happening in the basement.
And he doesn't know what the Riddler sounds like, so he doesn't let him talk.
That's all, folks.
Drea, what'd you think of this episode?
I liked it. I think it's great when we see multiple characters who can really get into their histories and we can really see them again. I don't know. I just like when you can revisit them in depth, and this episode really did that in a nice way.
Yeah, I agree. I liked this episode quite a bit. I think that all of the hype was certainly met in this episode, and in fact maybe a little bit more. It was better than I had even expected. I don't know that I ever saw this episode when I was a kid, and so I enjoyed watching it just this past week. Until next week, Drea, where can folks find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc. My website is underthemaskonline.com.
You can find me on Twitter. I am at bward028. You can find us both on Twitter. We are at Arkham Sessions. You can also email us. We are arkhamsessions@gmail.com. And you should absolutely go and visit our family over at fanboycomics.net, where you can check out all their other podcasts, which are pretty great. And then they've got a number of comics that are absolutely fantastic. You should check those out as well. And certainly keep an eye out on their site for our appearances as well as their appearances. We will all be at conventions coming up very shortly, certainly within the next month or so. So keep an eye out for those. Until next week, I am Brian Ward.
I am Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.